want to make a video summarizing my views on the American political system. And do not be fooled by my fancy Greek name. I was born and grew up in the United States and have been a resident of the United States my entire life. I am a second generation American on my mom's side. My mom is an immigrant or was an immigrant. And I am third generation on my, third and fourth generation on my father's side, because my father's parents, my paternal grandparents, were immigrants to the United States from Greece, as well as one of my paternal great grandparents. So, in summary, do not believe our system is as representative of the people as it should be, especially compared to other Western democracies or other Western republics. I think our system has essentially been left behind. It was an innovation. The United States of America was an innovation for the 18th century because it was, one of the original modern republics to be founded. However, it didn't really keep up, although we have had constitutional amendments over time. There was the Civil War fought over slavery, so on and so forth. We haven't changed our system sufficiently to rein in certain anti-democratic, oligarchic forces in our system. For one, there are some structural problems in our system. Our national legislature, Congress, has two chambers. It's a bicameral legislature. And the quote-unquote upper chamber, the Senate, the U.S. Senate, by its very structure, cannot represent the people of the United States. Each member state of the United States gets two Senate seats, two votes in the U.S. Senate, and that is obviously irrespective of population. Like, more people live in California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Illinois than basically the rest of the United States. So, I'm from Maryland, so I'm originally from Maryland, which is a relatively small state where essentially Washington, D.C. is. I think that's the most useful way of describing Maryland, because Maryland donated the land that now makes up Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C. is surrounded on three of its four sides by the state of Maryland. Anyway, I have lived in 7 American cities and towns. I travel the world for work. I'm a flight attendant. So I don't think I am a narrow-viewed person as far as my experience of the world, per se. I was radicalized, if you will. I know that's a loaded word. I was radicalized as a young adult or a person in his late teens, because I had a internship lobbying, and I was also a political activist for certain causes when I was younger. I had an internship lobbying both the U.S. Congress and the Maryland State Legislature, the Maryland General Assembly. And granted, I was dealing with difficult issues, but living in a fairly liberal, quote-unquote liberal, cosmopolitan state like Maryland, that the state is very well educated, relatively high income, relatively sophisticated, versus some other states in the United States, because of the nature of the state's demographics, very diverse, very educated. You have a workforce that deals a lot with the federal government and the military, and much of the state is an urban or suburban population. They're rural parts of the state, but basically the Baltimore Washington metropolitan area makes up most of the state's population. So it's a fairly cosmopolitan, educated, well-paid populace in Maryland versus some other states. Anyway, what I was going to say is, here I was in a relatively liberal, sophisticated, cosmopolitan state, and they were having trouble passing civil rights laws for gay people. So, and then the same thing with Congress. Like, although the American people were coming along and changing their attitudes on protecting gay people's human, civil, equal rights, both legislatures, the Maryland General Assembly and the U.S. Congress, proved themselves to be cowards. They could not represent the people of the United States. They couldn't step ahead and say, okay, not only are people really for this, not only would it be the right thing, but it seems like people are for this. So we should just go ahead and pass legislation protecting the human, civil, and equal rights of gay people, or LGBTQ plus people. That stuff, they proved themselves to be cowards, like when I was doing that kind of lobbying. So in a sense, it radicalized me, because I realized these representatives that we were electing, they don't represent us, and they can't represent us, because the reality is the House is so gerrymandered. The U.S. Senate structurally doesn't represent the people of the United States, and there's so much money in our system. We essentially, we do have legalized corruption in our system. We've had unlimited dark money in our political system for definitely the past 10 years, but dark money really was flowing into our system earlier than that. So we have legalized corruption in the United States. The U.S. Senate cannot represent the people of the United States. The House is so gerrymandered, and it's a winner-take-all system, so it's not like we have some sort of proportional representation in the House. And I have no love for the Democratic Party. I am a Democrat in the sense that, I mean the literal definition of the word Democrat, not the political party. I believe in democracy. I believe in rule of the people. I believe in one person, one vote, so on and so forth, majoritarian rule, all of that. I believe the limit on democracy is a constitution that prohibits the violation of people's human, civil, and equal rights, and delineates how government powers are basically limited and defined. Oh, excuse me. Sorry about that. So, but otherwise, I believe in democracy. I think that things that concern the government should be decided by a majority. So, anyway, I was radicalized when I had my lobbying experience, because I realized these people, these legislators, they don't represent us. Many of them are well-meaning, but they fall into the system, they get caught up in the game, money overtakes them, they get more concerned about the money than they do with actually representing their people. So Congress doesn't represent the people of the United States. And this is shown over and over and over again. On the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I know it's a controversial topic and people have strongly held opinions on different sides of it. But for real, scientific polling, the people of the United States have wanted a ceasefire in this latest war on Gaza that Israel's been waging since the October 7th attacks on parts of Israel by Hamas. Over 70% of Americans have wanted a ceasefire since nearly the beginning of this war. The Congress, barely any members of Congress have been calling for a ceasefire versus, 70% of the American people. And then our president and the Congress keeps throwing money and weapons at Israel. So there's actual support for stopping the wholesale throwing weapons at Israel, putting like a weapons embargo on Israel, and people wanted a ceasefire, and yet our government doesn't represent that at all. Why is that? It's because the defense industry makes a ton of money off of Israel and gets a ton of research off of Israel, because essentially Gaza and the West Bank are open air prisons. Israel, it's a joke that it's called the only democracy in the Middle East. That is a complete and utter joke, because think about it. They have over 5 million people under military dictatorship. The military occupation of the West Bank, and then essentially, although technically Israel withdrew out of Gaza, now they're destroying Gaza, you know, over 5 million people are controlled by a military dictatorship in Israel. So it's a quote unquote democracy if you're a citizen of Israel. But if you live in the West Bank or Gaza, you're under a military dictatorship. And currently you're under a military dictatorship that right now is committing genocide against you in Gaza. They are displacing people, almost the over 2 million people that live in Gaza, almost all of them have been displaced. More than 40,000 civilians have been killed, many of them children and women. So, what kind of government is Israel? I know there are well-meaning people in Israel who support a two-state solution, but a majority of Israelis have elected these crazy right-wing dickheads that are controlling the Israeli government, and several of them are war criminals. In theory, they should be arrested if they come into a country that, it participates in the International Criminal Court and so on and so forth, in the International Court of Justice. So why does our Congress and our presidents throw money and weapons at Israel, even though the American people really are against it? See, that right there shows you that our government doesn't represent us. So not only can the U.S. Senate not represent the people of the United States, and then it has its ridiculous filibuster rule where basically one senator can screw everything up on a piece of legislation and require 60 votes, like a kind of a supermajority in order to pass legislation. But so not only does the Senate have the inability to represent the people of the United States by its very constitution, the government just does what its donors want it to do, not what the people want it to do. And the sad part is that in theory, the people of the United States could clear out the House of Representatives every 2 years. If we simply voted for someone else who is not the incumbent every 2 years, the House of Representatives would be cleared out. There would be no incumbents. So in theory, the people of the United States do have the power to, at least one chamber of our national legislature we could eliminate every 2 years. The Senate, because they have 6-year terms, they can be removed every, I guess a third of the Senate could be wiped out every 2 years if you wanted to. Like if you could say, okay, these senators, we're not going to give them more than one term. We could do that too, but Americans don't do that. Most Americans have no idea who their representative is in Congress, let alone, I think we have like abysmal voter participation in the United States. We have voluntary voting. So I think in most elections, maybe 40 to 50%, most national election, 40 to 50% participation occurs. That's ridiculous. That means that the people elected, they can't represent us anyway because they're not even being elected by a majority of the constituents eligible to vote for them. They're just being elected by a plurality of the people who showed up to vote. So our system skews rightward because of the U.S. Senate and the Electoral College, because think about it, states where all of these people live only have 2 votes in the Senate, and states where far fewer people live have 2 votes in the Senate. So rural people tend to be more conservative and more right-leaning in general. It's not universal, but it tends to be that way. So that means that the US Senate, unless they make an active effort to respond to scientific polling of the American people's positions, the US Senate skews rightward. And it's the US Senate that ultimately determines who sits in the federal judiciary, so on and so forth. So we have these undemocratic institutions within our governments, and many other Western democracies have surpassed us because in their parliamentary systems, there's proportional representation, so on and so forth, things that ensure that the way people voted is the result that winds up representing them in parliament. So our system has lagged behind. It was an innovation again in the 18th century, but it hasn't changed enough to actually represent the people of the United States. So I am a fan of democracy. I support democracy, but I think the United States is one of the least democratic of the Western democracies because of these flaws that we have in our system, the unlimited dark money, so on and so forth. The only way we're going to stop this is if we have widespread voter participation and we throw people out of office. So they fear us, so then they do the reforms that are needed.